My husband ended our 13-year marriage in 47 seconds. But that was not the moment that destroyed him. That moment came 3 days later.
My husband ended our 13-year marriage in 47 seconds. But that was not the moment that destroyed him. That moment came 3 days later, when I walked him to his attorney's office, introduced myself as Daniel Mercer's wife, and watched every drop of color disappear from the attorney's face. Hello. My name is Claire Mercer, and until that Monday morning, I believed I knew the man sleeping beside me. Daniel and I lived outside Richmond, Virginia, in a white colonial house with dark shutters and an oak tree that dropped branches every time the wind rose. We had no children, though not by choice. After years of doctor visits and disappointment, we had learned to build a life around the silence. At least, I thought we had. I was 41 and worked from home as a bookkeeping consultant for small construction companies. Daniel was 44 and owned Mercer Development Group, a real estate business he had built during our marriage. People called him self-made. That always made me smile, because I remembered the beginning. I remembered selling my grandmother's small lake cottage so Daniel could buy his first neglected duplex. I remembered painting walls after midnight, keeping the accounts, negotiating with suppliers, and packing sandwiches because we could not afford restaurants. I remembered the winter our furnace failed, and we wore coats indoors so the company payroll would clear. My name did not appear on the office door, but my fingerprints were on everything that had built his success. The desk phone rang at exactly 10 o'clock. Daniel had left before sunrise for what he called an emergency meeting in Baltimore. I answered while reviewing invoices. Claire. His voice was flat and distant. Is everything all right? I asked. No, I'm not coming home. At first I thought someone had died. Then he continued. Our marriage is over. I've retained counsel. From this point forward, you will speak only through my attorney. I stared at the blue mug beside my keyboard. It said World's Best Partner, a gift I had given him after we closed on our first commercial property. Daniel, what are you talking about? You'll receive the documents today. 13 years, and you're telling me by phone. He exhaled, as if I were delaying an appointment. There's nothing to discuss. My attorney is Ethan Cole at Cole, Barrett & Wynn. He'll explain the settlement. Is there someone else? Silence. That silence answered me. Who is she? Do not make this uglier than it needs to be. You called me from another city to end our marriage, and I'm making it ugly. The offer is generous, Claire. Take it and move on. Then he disconnected. I remained seated with the phone against my ear until the empty tones stopped. At 11:30, a courier arrived. Inside the envelope was a proposed separation agreement. Daniel offered me 6 months of health insurance, $12,000, and permission to stay in the house for 60 days. The house I had helped buy, the company I had helped build, was described as Daniel's separate property. Our investment accounts were barely mentioned. A paragraph near the end said I voluntarily gave up any interest in Mercer Development Group and all related companies. It was not a settlement. It was an eraser. I called Daniel once. It went to voicemail. I called again. His number had blocked me. At 2 o'clock, his assistant emailed me one sentence. Mr. Mercer has instructed that all communication be directed to Mr. Cole. By evening, anger had replaced shock. I opened the locked cabinet in my office and pulled out 13 years of tax returns, company ledgers, loan records, and closing documents. Daniel had never cared about paperwork. I did. Numbers had always been honest with me, even when people were not. The first strange thing appeared in our most recent tax return. The income from 2 commercial buildings was missing. I checked the year before. The buildings had been there then, under Mercer Development Group. I searched the state's online corporate registry and found that ownership had moved 8 months earlier to a company called Blue Heron Holdings. The registered agent was Ethan Cole. The second strange thing was our home. According to the county record, a lion had been placed against it 6 weeks earlier for $800,000. I had never signed a loan. I downloaded the deed of trust. There, at the bottom, was my name, Claire Mercer, and beside it was a signature that was not mine. I felt cold all over. Daniel had not simply left me. He had been preparing to bury me under debt. I called Ethan Cole's office. His receptionist offered me an appointment on Thursday. I said the matter involved a forged signature and an active client of the firm. Suddenly, an opening appeared Wednesday morning. That night, Daniel's closet looked untouched, but closer inspection told a different story. The expensive suits were gone. So were his passport, watches, and the leather travel case I had bought for our 10th anniversary. In the garage, I found a small storage key beneath the driver's seat of his old truck. The label read B214. I should have waited for a lawyer. Instead, I drove through the rain to a storage facility near the airport. Unit B214 contained 3 filing boxes, 2 framed photographs, and a suitcase. In the photographs, Daniel stood beside a blonde woman I recognized as Vanessa Reed, the director of marketing at his company. In one picture, they were kissing on a beach. In another, Daniel's hand rested on her pregnant stomach. The date printed on the back was 5 months earlier. The suitcase contained baby clothes. The first filing box held brochures for villas in Costa Rica. The second held bank statements for Blue Heron Holdings. The third contained a folder marked Personnel EC. Inside was a copy of a marriage certificate. It named Daniel Mercer as the groom and Vanessa Reed as the bride. The ceremony date was 6 weeks earlier. My knees almost failed beneath me. Daniel had married another woman while he was still married to me. And the witness signature at the bottom belonged to Ethan Cole. I did not sleep that night. I placed every document in order across my dining table: the forged loan, the secret company, the photographs, and the marriage certificate. Then I noticed something I had missed. The certificate was not issued in Virginia. It came from a small county in North Carolina. Daniel had listed himself as divorced. Under former spouse, he had written my full name. Under date marriage ended, he had given a date from the previous year. He had invented a divorce that never happened. At 9 the next morning, I entered the offices of Cole, Barrett and Wynn, carrying only my purse and a thin blue folder. The receptionist led me into a conference room with windows overlooking downtown Richmond. A man in his late 50s entered 5 minutes later. His silver tie was perfectly straight. His expression suggested he was accustomed to controlling every room. Mrs. Mercer. Les. I'm Ethan Cole. I represent Daniel. He offered no handshake. He sat, opened a file, and began speaking as if reading the weather. Your husband wishes to resolve this efficiently. The proposal gives you immediate cash and sufficient time to relocate. Considering that you were not involved in the growth of his company, it is a practical offer. I let him finish. Then I said, before we continue, I need to make sure there is no confusion. I am Daniel Mercer's legal wife. Ethan Cole went pale. Not surprised, terrified. His pen stopped above the page. Excuse me, I said I'm his wife. We married 13 years ago in Henrico County. We have never divorced, separated, or filed any legal action. His eyes moved to my left hand, where I still wore my wedding ring. That is not the information my client provided. I know. I opened my blue folder and slid a certified copy of my marriage certificate across the table. He stared at it for several seconds. Then he rose and closed the conference room door. Mrs. Mercer, do you have an attorney? Not yet. You should obtain one. Why? Is the offer not generous anymore? His jaw tightened. I cannot advise you. I represent Daniel. Did you witness his marriage to Vanessa Reed? The silence that followed was the first honest thing anyone from Daniel's side had given me. Ethan sat down slowly. Where did you get that information? Is it true? I cannot discuss privileged communication. A marriage ceremony is not privileged. Neither is fraud. He leaned back, studying me differently now. What exactly do you want, Mrs. Mercer? I want to know why my signature appears on an $800,000 loan. That was the moment his fear became panic. He closed Daniel's settlement file. This meeting is over. It has barely begun. You need independent counsel. I agree. I stood and collected my certificate. At the door, I turned back. One more question. When Daniel told you he was divorced, did you believe him? Ethan looked at the table. He did not answer. I left his office and drove directly to meet Rebecca Shaw, a family law attorney recommended by one of my clients. Rebecca was short, sharp-eyed, and unimpressed by expensive men. She listened without interrupting while I described the phone call and placed each document on her desk. When she reached the second marriage certificate, she removed her glasses. Claire, this is bigger than a divorce. How much bigger? Bigamy, forgery, fraudulent conveyance, possible bank fraud, and maybe tax fraud. If the attorney knowingly assisted him, the state bar will be interested too. For the first time since Daniel's call, I felt the floor steady beneath me. Rebecca told me not to contact Daniel, Vanessa, or Ethan again. She filed an emergency petition to freeze major marital assets and prevent Daniel from selling or transferring property. By Friday afternoon, a judge had signed a temporary restraining order. Daniel called me 7 minutes later from an unknown number. His cold voice was gone. What did you do? You told me to speak through your attorney. You froze my operating accounts. Our operating accounts. You have no idea what you're interfering with. Then explain the forged signature. He paused. Ethan made an administrative mistake. Did Ethan also accidentally watch you marry Vanessa? Daniel began breathing harder. Listen to me, Claire. Vanessa is pregnant. I was trying to protect the baby. By stealing from me, I built that company. With money from my grandmother's cottage. You gave me that money. I invested it in our future. You'll get something. But if you keep pushing, lawyers will consume everything. That sounds like a threat. It's reality. Here is reality, Daniel. You have one wife, one imaginary divorce, one illegal marriage, and one forged loan. You should be more worried about your future than mine. I ended the call. My hands shook afterward, but not from fear. For 13 years, Daniel had depended on my calm. He had mistaken it for weakness. On Saturday morning, I discovered how far his plan had gone. A woman named Marisol called me from Mercer Development Group. She had worked in accounts payable for 6 years. Mrs. Mercer, she whispered, Mr. Mercer told everyone you had a breakdown and left him last year. I gripped the phone. Last year. He said Vanessa helped him rebuild his life. They had an office celebration after the wedding. Daniel had not only invented a divorce on paper, he had rewritten my existence for his employees. Marisol sent Rebecca copies of internal transfer orders. Over 11 months, Daniel had moved nearly $4 million in properties and cash into Blue Heron Holdings. Vanessa owned 51%. Ethan Cole owned 5%. Daniel owned the rest. The attorney's shock now made sense. He was not merely protecting a dishonest client. He was Daniel's business partner. Rebecca hired a forensic accountant named Calvin Ross. Calvin spoke softly, wore old-fashioned suspenders, and became excited by spreadsheets in a way most people became excited by sports. Within a week, he found the design of Daniel's trap. The $800,000 loan against our house had not gone into Mercer Development Group. It had gone to Blue Heron Holdings. Blue Heron then used the money as a down payment on a luxury apartment complex. If Daniel's plan had worked, he would have taken the profitable property while leaving the debt attached to the home offered to me in the divorce. The $12,000 was not generosity. It was bait. If I signed quickly, I would accept responsibility for a house carrying more debt equity and waive my claim to the assets purchased with that debt. Calvin found something else. Years earlier, when Mercer Development almost failed, I had loaned the company $275,000 from the sale of my grandmother's cottage. Daniel had drafted a promissory note, promising repayment with interest. He had forgotten it existed. I had not. With accumulated interest, the company owed me more than $400,000 before any marital division began. Rebecca smiled when she saw it. He ordered you to take crumbs, she said. He forgot you owned part of the bakery. Daniel responded to the asset freeze with performance. He filed papers claiming I had been emotionally unstable for years. He said I had never participated in the business and had stolen private company records out of jealousy. Vanessa signed a statement saying Daniel had assured her he was legally divorced. Ethan withdrew as Daniel's divorce attorney, but he did not cooperate. Instead, he hired his own lawyer. Then someone broke into my house. I returned from Rebecca's office and found the back door open. Nothing valuable was missing. The television remained on the wall. Jewelry remained in my bedroom. Only my office had been disturbed. The locked cabinet stood open, and the original promissory note was gone. For 10 minutes, I sat on the kitchen floor trying to breathe. Then I remembered the scanner. I had scanned every page years earlier and stored encrypted copies online. Rebecca had already filed a copy with the court. Whoever entered my house had risked a felony for a document that was no longer useful. A neighbor's doorbell camera showed Daniel's operations manager, Kyle Benson, parking nearby that afternoon. Police found my backdoor key in his truck. Kyle lasted 6 hours in custody before he began talking. He said Daniel had ordered him to retrieve personal company material. In return, Daniel promised him $50,000 and a promotion. Kyle also revealed that Daniel planned to leave the country. The Costa Rica brochures were not for a vacation. Daniel and Vanessa had placed a deposit on a villa through another shell company. He intended to move funds overseas before the court could trace them. Rebecca requested another emergency hearing. Daniel arrived wearing the navy suit I had bought him for our anniversary. Vanessa sat behind him, one hand resting on her stomach. Ethan sat across the aisle beside his own lawyer. For one painful second, I remembered tying Daniel's necktie before company dinners. I remembered the man who once slept in a hospital chair for 3 nights after my surgery. I wondered whether that man had ever been real. Then the hearing began. Calvin explained the money trail. Rebecca presented the forged deed of trust, the second marriage certificate, and Kyle's statement. The bank's notary testified that she had never met me, even though her seal appeared beside my supposed signature. The judge turned to Daniel. Mr. Mercer, did you represent yourself as divorced when you applied for a marriage license? Daniel's attorney stood. My client invokes his right against self-incrimination. The room became very quiet. The judge expanded the freeze, surrendered Daniel's passport to the court, and appointed a temporary receiver to control the businesses. Outside the courtroom, Vanessa approached me. You're trying to destroy our baby's future, she said. I looked at her carefully. She was younger than me, perhaps 32. Her anger seemed genuine, but fear lived beneath it. Did Daniel tell you I abandoned him? He said you had been divorced for a year. Did he show you a decree? Her eyes shifted. Ethan said everything was legal. That answer mattered. Did you sign the Blue Heron documents? Daniel handles the business. Your name owns 51%. She stared at me. I realized then that Daniel had built a second trap. This one was for Vanessa. He had put the majority of the stolen assets in her name. If the scheme collapsed, he could claim she controlled the company. He had used her pregnancy, her trust, and her name as shields. Vanessa left without another word. 2 days later, she called Rebecca and asked for her own lawyer. The wall around Daniel began to crack. Vanessa turned over emails in which Daniel told Ethan to finish the Claire problem before the baby arrives. She provided messages showing Ethan knew there was no divorce decree. She also produced a voice recording from a dinner at which Daniel joked that I would sign anything if he frightened me enough. In the recording, Ethan said, "Make the offer small and the deadline short. Panic is useful." That sentence ended Ethan Cole's career. Rebecca sent the evidence to the state bar and federal investigators. The bank reviewed the forged loan and discovered Ethan's office had submitted the documents. The notary admitted Ethan had paid her to stamp them without witnessing my signature. Then came the final betrayal. Calvin found a life insurance policy Daniel had purchased on me for $3 million. Daniel was the beneficiary. The policy itself was legal. The application was not. It claimed I suffered from a serious heart condition and listed an address I had never used. Someone had signed my name to that document too. There was no proof Daniel intended to harm me, but when Rebecca told me about the policy, every memory changed shape. The pills Daniel encouraged me to take for stress. The weekend trip he kept insisting I make alone. The loose stair rail he promised to repair. Maybe they meant nothing. Maybe they meant everything. I replaced every lock, installed cameras, and stopped staying alone. I was no longer fighting only for a fair divorce. I was fighting to reclaim my name from a man who had used it like a tool. The criminal case moved faster after Vanessa cooperated. Daniel was charged with bank fraud, identity theft, forgery, and conspiracy. Ethan faced many of the same charges, along with professional misconduct. The notary accepted a plea agreement. Kyle testified in exchange for reduced charges. Daniel continued pretending he could control the outcome. Through his new attorney, he offered me $750,000 if I agreed to support the release of the business assets and remain silent publicly. I declined. The next offer was $1.5 million. I declined again. Then he asked to meet me. Rebecca arranged it in a secure conference room with attorneys present. Daniel looked older than he had 1 month earlier. His expensive haircut had grown unevenly, and deep shadows sat beneath his eyes. For a while neither of us spoke. Finally, he said, "We were happy once." I was. He flinched. "I never wanted this to become so ugly." "You forged my name." Ethan handled the paperwork. "You married another woman. Vanessa was pregnant." "Pregnancy does not create a divorce." He leaned forward. I panicked. I had investors expecting results. The company needed liquidity. "You would never have agreed to the loan. So you stole my consent." I was going to make it right. With $12,000. That was a starting point. "No, Daniel. It was the price you put on 13 years of my life." His face hardened. There he was, the man from the phone call. "You think you won?" he said. "But if the company collapses, there will be nothing left for you." "You still don't understand. I would rather leave with nothing than help you keep what you stole." For the first time, I saw that money was not Daniel's deepest need. Control was. He could survive losing property. What he could not endure was seeing me make a decision he had not designed. The meeting ended. 3 months later, Ethan Cole pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit bank fraud. He surrendered his law license and agreed to testify against Daniel. Once Ethan began talking, the final secret surfaced. Daniel had transferred assets not only to Blue Heron, but to 4 other companies. He had hidden income from investors and the Internal Revenue Service. He had also used false financial statements to obtain loans. The empire everyone admired was partly built on my work, and partly built on lies. The receiver sold 2 properties to cover legitimate debts. The remaining holdings were valued at more than $8 million. In our civil settlement, I received the house free of the fraudulent lien, repayment of my original company loan with interest, half the remaining marital assets, and full ownership of the first duplex Daniel and I had renovated together. I asked for that duplex for a reason. It was not our most valuable property. It was the place where I had spent nights scraping paint, while Daniel promised that whatever we built would always belong to both of us. The court annulled his marriage to Vanessa because he was never free to marry her. She gave birth to a healthy boy and moved to North Carolina to live near her sister. I did not become her friend, but I stopped seeing her as my enemy. She had made selfish choices. She had ignored questions she should have asked. But Daniel had lied to both of us in different ways. Revenge would have meant destroying her. Justice meant holding the right person responsible. Daniel eventually pleaded to multiple financial crimes. At sentencing, he stood in a federal courtroom and apologized to his employees, investors, Vanessa, and the court. He did not mention me until the judge asked whether he had anything to say to his wife. Daniel turned. Our eyes met across the room. "Claire," he said, "I'm sorry you forced this to happen." Even then, he could not accept responsibility. The judge noticed. So did everyone else. Daniel received a prison sentence of several years and was ordered to pay restitution. The exact number of years mattered less to me than the moment the courtroom doors closed behind him. For 13 years, I had measured my life around his ambition. That day, I walked outside without waiting for him. I used part of my settlement to renovate the old duplex. But I did not turn it into luxury apartments. I created temporary housing for women rebuilding their lives after financial abuse. The first resident was a retired teacher whose husband had hidden 30 years of savings. The second was a young mother whose boyfriend had opened credit cards in her name. I helped them organize documents, repair credit, and find attorneys. Sometimes I simply sat at the kitchen table and listened. People imagine abuse as shouting, bruises, or broken doors. Sometimes it is a forged signature. Sometimes it is a missing account. Sometimes it is a spouse who makes all the decisions and calls that love. 16 months after Daniel's phone call, I returned to Ethan Cole's former office building. His name had been removed from the directory. Another firm occupied the suite. I stood in the lobby remembering the way he had turned pale when I said, "Yes, I'm his wife." At the time, I believed his fear came from recognizing me. Now I understood. He had recognized the one thing Daniel's entire plan could not survive. The truth had walked into the room carrying its own name. I sold my wedding ring and donated the money to a legal aid organization. Then I removed Mercer from my name and became Claire Bennett again. On the anniversary of that cold phone call, I drove to my grandmother's lake. Her cottage belonged to someone else now, but the water looked the same. I sat on the public dock until sunset painted the surface gold. I thought about the woman I had been when the phone rang, loyal, exhausted, and so accustomed to being useful that she had forgotten she deserved to be valued. I did not hate her. She had kept records. She had remembered the loan. She had walked into an intimidating office while her heart was breaking and spoken one simple, undeniable sentence. That woman saved me. Daniel offered me crumbs because he believed hunger had made me weak. He never understood that I had helped bake the bread, built the table, and kept every receipt. And when justice finally arrived, I did not have to shout. I only had to tell the truth and let his lies answer for themselves.